Hello and welcome to season 7 of Sal Silvester on the future of leadership. Season 7 is focused on elevating human performance at work. This has been a super fun season, maybe one of my favorites so far, because we're exploring what leaders can do to help themselves and others improve their performance at work. And this season's really about thinking like an athlete. Athletes train in a certain way to enhance their performance on the field or at an event. Why wouldn't leaders do the same? Why shouldn't we think about ourselves as corporate athletes? Today, my guest is Dr. Gavriel Schneider. Dr. Gav is an authority in risk management, security, leadership, and resilience. He has an extensive career in frontline and senior leadership experience with a strong academic background. He's an award-winning business leader. He's an accomplished author. He's a lifelong martial artist. By the way, you'll hear us talk about his 8th degree black belt and how that impacts his performance at work. And Dr. Gav has developed an award-winning Presilience approach, and we're going to talk a lot about his latest book, Presilience: How to Navigate Risk, Embrace Opportunity, and Build Resilience. So in this interview, we go pretty deep into how to leverage the mind, your brain, and your psych and your physiology so in this interview, we talk about how to leverage your mind, your brain, and your physiology to perform your best at work, especially when it comes to risk management and decision making. All right, let's go to our interview with Dr. Gav now. Dr. Gav, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you here today.
Thanks for having me, Sal.
So we're going to jump into your book, Presilience, but before we do, you have a very strong connection to martial arts. You're an 8th degree black belt. Tell us a little bit about that and how that connects to your life.
Sure. So it's not an understatement to say that almost every business achievement I can link back to my martial arts history. And I started training when I was 5 years old. I was a very sick child. And there were some doctors who said I'd never exercised my whole life, and earned my first black belt when I was 14, got onto the South African Taekwondo team when I was 15, and just kept going. But fundamentally, I think for me, those non-tangible attributes, things like focus, discipline, commitment, it's built all of that. So if I look, even we're going to have a nice conversation about resilience and risk, my skills and understanding of leadership, decision-making, and actually challenging myself have all come from the martial arts. And it's no small point to say that without that, I think if I didn't have that escapism to be able to train and equally to teach, my performance as an executive would be significantly less effective.
Oh, yeah. That's spot on with where we're going with this entire season, as corporate athletes, if you will. And I know you write about that in Presilience. What have you learned from martial arts that helps you improve your performance at work specifically?
There's too many to talk about in a short podcast, but I'd probably say 2 of the main ones. The first one is grit. That ability to actually go through hard stuff and keep performing. That has absolutely come through not just normal martial arts training, but a lot of the full contact stuff, and the ability to actually push your body past where you think it can go has enabled me to take, I won't say gambles, calculated risks in my business career, where if I think I didn't have that faith in myself that came from putting myself through, lots and lots of hardship in the martial arts world, the stickability wouldn't be there. And I think the other piece is, it's often the martial arts world is sometimes described as a microcosm for life. You have to face fear, you have to work with other people, you have to overcome adrenaline, you have to be disciplined, you have to work on multifaceted parts of who you are. And I think in the modern business world, as an executive, if you can't be adaptive, if you can't meet your people where they're at, and if you can't be fluid enough to change your strategy or approach when something isn't working, success is limited. And I've really learned all of that through martial arts.
Yeah, it's really such a great metaphor for life as a whole. And I think for leaders to be successful, we have to think holistically about our entire life. And I see so many executives who are so successful financially but they've let their health go lack. Their relationships at home aren't strong. I mean, there's just so many elements here. And I think there's an interconnectedness between all of those different components and performance at work.
Agreed. And maybe the last part of that is, fundamentally we are still animals in the way we perform. So when we're stressed, our adrenal response kicks over, the animal brain takes over, and the ability to be able to manage pressure effectively is something martial arts gives you that not a lot of other disciplines do give you in the same way.
Right.
And that piece of, there's a saying in martial arts, steel sharpens steel, iron sharpens iron as one person sharpens another. And you get that ability when you're training with somebody to make yourself better. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity and a metaphor back to the business world around how do we make
Yes.
each other better? How do I make my team better? How do I make my clients better? And how do we apply
Hmm.
all of that? And it's fascinating that even though it's combative in nature, when you do it properly with the right mindset, it's all about growth.
Mm. I think I saw this quote in your book. Tell me if I'm mistaken. Train hard, fight easy.
For
And
sure.
it reminds me, I think, I'll let you explain it, but it reminds me of a saying we used to have in the military, which is you fight like you train. And so the way that you train then shows up, in this case, on the battlefield. But I'm curious, like, where this quote comes from for you and what it means.
So it was interesting. If I go back to my early teenage years, I started with full contact taekwondo. And in fact, one of the
Mm.
first experiences I had competing was very negative. I actually got knocked out and broke my nose.
Wow.
And I was young. And I had this innate fear after that of contact. But I landed up training in one of the hardest schools of full contact in Israel. I became a live-in student of a grandmaster by the name of Dennis Hanover. And his system is incredibly hard. And you fight and you spar and you take a lot of punishment. But practically, the message there, and I've really adapted that throughout my martial arts career. Not everyone feels the same way, but for me, if I've given somebody a black belt, they should know that whatever they will face out there is easier than what they've accomplished.
Mm.
So if you've trained hard enough to be able to push yourself in a relatively safe, controlled environment past what you ever thought you could achieve, whatever you face in life should be much easier to overcome. So to
Yes.
your point around the train hard, fight easy piece, if you've done the homework and built your capabilities, whatever comes in front of you, you should be able to manage. And, one of the things we'll talk about maybe is a little bit how Presilience relates back to disruption management.
Yeah.
And more we see in our business world, we're managing disruptions almost on a continuous basis as opposed to business as usual.
Yes.
And, that ability of train hard, fight easy, if you've built the right scaffolding of the way you think, the way you act, the way you perform. If you've been able to get your people with you who understand that and you're united in your front, that's the training, right? That's getting yourself ready for whatever you've got to face.
Mm.
See so many corporations who always look at disruption or some sort of unexpected event as a very big negative, as opposed to, hold on, this is an opportunity for us to test what we've done, for us to innovate and perform,
Right.
which was actually a lot of the basis for Presilience.
Interesting. Gosh, there's so many places we could go with that too. One of the things that came up as I heard you talking was, um, to me, confidence isn't usually what we lead with. You use the word capability, and usually, like, it takes courage to then build that capability, and then confidence is the output. So if you've trained hard in those environments, pushed yourself beyond where you think you can go, the output of that is confidence, which then allows you to take on those challenges.
Love that. And 100% agree. In fact, there was an interesting study done of girls on college campuses that learned self-defense. And they found that there was a significant difference in the targeting of the girls who had done self-defense versus the ones who hadn't. And
Uh,
that was just based on confidence. The fact that they trained meant they were more confident, meant they weren't selected as victims quite as much as people who weren't trained. So
mm,
your point is exactly right. And one of the things I talk about in the book is something I refer to as the whole of person model. Our work life, our virtual life, and our personal life. And gone are the days where that idea of work-life separation, work-life balance applies the way it used to. all of us are living these complex lives where we work from home, we're interacting virtually all the time, and our personal life creeps in and our work life creeps in. So my view,
Right.
particularly with Presilience, is let's develop the skill set that enables you to thrive in all domains and not just focus on one specific domain. For example, what is the point of being so cyber safe, but you make stupid decisions and, for example, have a car accident when you're driving because you're not situationally aware in that domain? So,
Yes.
one of the interesting pieces I found in a lot of the research, probably a good segue to this, is I taught a postgraduate program in the psychology of risk for almost a decade.
Mm.
And it was just fascinating because most of my graduates were chief risk officers, chief executives, high performers who are already in the C-suite. And I would always ask them, why are you coming to do this program? And almost all of them brought a human dimension to it. They wanted people to want to follow them. They wanted people to want to buy into the corporate vision. They want people to be able to make great decisions because they wanted, not because the corporate policies tell them to. And the psychological link is so powerful there. And when you can understand a bit of psychology, a bit of neuroscience, you don't have to be an expert. You can get so much out of your people and yourself that you couldn't
Mm.
if you're just going, this is my job. These are the 5 things I have to achieve by the end of each day. And
Right.
those are the metrics I'm measured on.
Yeah, I love that. To me, it seems like one builds commitment, the other, when it's just those 5 things, builds compliance. People do what you say, but it's because of some external source versus a true level of commitment to what you're trying to change within a business.
Well, you've actually given me the perfect segue, so I'll jump in there if I can. And
Yes.
part of the reason we landed up doing all this work on Presilience was that we kept finding that compliance was not enough. And we would work for clients or we'd provide training, and clients wanted to continually just tick this compliance box. But realistically, you can't comply your way to managing disruption. You can't comply your way to high performance. You can't comply
Mm.
your way to engagement. So this is where the world of resilience kind of crept in. And particularly through COVID, organizations and individuals started to realize, hey, compliance ain't enough. What do we do differently? The challenge we've got in the modern world is resilience sometimes isn't enough either, or it's the wrong skill set, because if we could stop something catastrophic from happening, then why do we want to be resilient and have to go through it? The
To
flip
begin
side
with,
of
right?
Yeah, exactly
Yeah.
right. And I see that in the world of risk management over and over again. There's more reasons to say no than there are to say yes. There's more, as it was described to me once by a very experienced risk leader. He mentioned he was sick and tired of being referred to as the handbrake to happiness.
Mm.
And, that's the compliance push on it. But the resilience side of it is very frustrating because with the resilience view, you're often going, do I have enough redundancy? Do I have enough backups? Do we have enough spare cash? Do we have enough spare resources to
Yeah.
manage something or survive something unexpected? Where we know that some of the best innovations come through adversity. Sometimes the real bonding of a team happens when we face something unexpected. And, we don't have to look far. COVID, now tariffs, but the list of disruptions is almost endless. And, one of the interesting things in the research we were doing that led to this intersection of compliance and resilience, and where risk and resilience require the Presilience approach, was really about 2 missing ingredients. The first was what we already discussed, which is proactive prevention.
Mm.
How do we absolutely pick those things that will kill us, whether it's personal or business? Because, one simple example of the segue with martial arts is, and we discussed this actually as we kicked off our informal chat, Sal,
Right.
what's the
Right.
point of being the richest person who has no quality of life and no health?
Yeah.
So it's balancing that. But the other piece that we found was opportunity centrism. That if we
Mm.
can start to look at risk as an opportunity, which most entrepreneurs do, but very few corporate executives are comfortable doing, because sometimes you get promoted by not making mistakes as opposed to creating opportunity.
It's a good
And
point.
in a world full of disruption, opportunities abound if you look at them that way. If you look at them in a negative slant, then you're constantly playing catch up. So that was the downside of resilience and why we felt we had to do something a bit different, which was really the birth of Presilience about 7 years ago.
Mm. So it's kind of like you're taking the good things from resilience, but you're also adding the proactive prevention along with looking at opportunity differently or looking at risk differently as an opportunity for innovation and growth.
Interesting. It's a part of the thing that we've really been working on is the challenge of the way the human mind works and the way the brain
Hmm.
works.
Yes.
We love chunking information together and we really like binary type things. We want to go, this is good or it's bad, it's black or it's white. But actually, the world we live in is non-binary, right? There are so many gray areas and so many things that have a bit of good, a bit of bad, a bit of bad, a bit of good. So really what we're trying to get across, what we're trying to do is to actually get this balance right between compliance,
Hmm.
because if you're not compliant and something goes wrong, all your efforts may actually just land up with you in jail. If you just rely on resilience, you can get burnt out or you can break.
Yeah.
And if we only rely on presilience but don't have compliance and resilience, then you're not going to be able to actually function. So it's actually, I like to think of it as a three-legged stool or a triangle. You want to get the right balance of compliance, resilience, and presilience as a package. And what are
Hmm.
the outcomes? High performance. And even better than that, you get sustainable high performance during business as usual, and you get the ability to thrive through disruption, not just survive.
Mm.
So that's really the fundamental basis for the work we're doing at the moment.
I love that. You outlined I wanted to zoom in a bit on where you outlined some enablers inside of your book, the leveraging your mind or leveraging the mind. You started to talk about the psychology of resilience, leveraging the brain and leveraging the body. Because I think this is where, in a short podcast, our listeners might get sort of the biggest lift. Talk a bit about how you think about leveraging the mind to support the psychology of resilience.
Brilliant. And we could probably talk on this one particularly for hours, but
Right.
one of the fundamental pieces in the world of risk and leadership that I often feel is underexplored, which is an area I'm very passionate about, is decision making.
Hmm.
So if you don't understand how your own mind works and how you make decisions yourself, both in a business as usual stable state and in a disruptive state, you can't then train yourself to be able to make better decisions in either environment, which
Right.
means you're not going to be great at risk. The enabler of that is also leadership and followership, right? So if I don't know when to lead and I don't know when to follow, which has a lot to do with understanding yourself and how you think, feel, and act, you're limiting your performance. So the psychological piece is for me the starting point, right? Because if we can't control that voice in our own head,
Yes.
and it's such a simple example of this, I don't think there's any high performer in the world that has not suffered from imposter syndrome at some stage in their
Hmm.
career.
Hmm.
And I'm always coaching and mentoring either my students or my clients in the fact that if you're feeling imposter syndrome, it means you're stretching, it means you're
Yeah.
growing.
Yes.
But there's a fine line between lying and basically setting yourself up for failure and stretching. And that starts with understanding yourself. So you can't understand yourself without a basic understanding of psychology.
Hmm.
And don't get me wrong, psychology, we can't dissect the mind. So we can't unpack it and go, this is exactly what it looks like. But there's such a body of knowledge that's been built now that we don't have to start from scratch. We can actually
Yeah.
look at some of, for example, Daniel Kahneman's work on decision making and system one and system two theory and just leverage it. We can look at things like chunking, which is a
Yes.
psychological concept of how we bind information together, and we can manage it. And probably the biggest one is managing cognitive biases and heuristics. Because if
Yes.
we can't manage our own bias, what makes us think we're going to be able to manage the bias of our team or our clients? So, linking to that also with the psychological piece, we actually like to look at something I call the simple ethical checklist. Good for
Mm.
me, good for you, good for us, good for the greater good. So, four-dimensional thinking, right? How can I think four-dimensionally if I can't even think two-dimensionally? If I can't even accept this is what I think and this is what you think, and where's the intersection? So it does start with understanding self, but then it moves to understanding others,
Mm.
potentially then understanding organizations, and ultimately then we can look at how does this impact societies. So the psych piece is fascinating.
Yeah, I'm Can you talk? Thank you for that, and I love that the idea of thinking broadly around the ethical decision making. Good for me, good for others, the organization, and then beyond the organization. Stress inoculation and cognitive bias. Can you talk a little bit more about like how those things impact our decision making and what we should be thinking about as leaders so we can perform at our best?
You're asking me the best question, Sal. Thank you. So when I did my PhD, which is now 15 years ago, the concept of stress inoculation kept coming up in the way we prepare people to make decisions under incredible stress.
Mm,
So if we haven't actually built the capability to manage our own adrenal response and to control our animalistic flight or fight responses,
yes.
people will not follow us because we're not in control of even ourselves. So the concept of stress inoculation is critically important. And the idea with stress inoculation is you don't want to be in the middle, and you're an ex-army officer, as you shared with me. You don't want to be in the middle of a firefight for the very first time when you're actually in combat in a live theater.
Right.
You need to train and prepare yourself so that you don't freeze, don't panic, and can perform. I find the same thing with business leaders. Right. So part of the challenge, and this is fascinating in the world we're in, right? If we go back 50 years, you would almost never see a leader under 40 or 50 years old.
Mm-hmm.
You would have seen experience leads to the evolution of good decision making and the ability to apply the right leadership characteristics. In the world we're in now, you often see people running multi-million dollar, even sometimes billion-dollar organizations in their 20s and 30s because of the
Right.
tech we experience. So part of the challenge with that is this idea of stress inoculation. How have those people learned to deal with the stresses that are going to come naturally with leading and trying to grow and trying to achieve business success? And it's fascinating to actually see the process that we go through to actually build the ability to cope with stress. Because if we've done it well, it's cross-dimensional, right? If I'm good at managing stress in a martial arts domain, it's not that hard to transition that to a business domain if we let ourselves. Very often the concept, and we go back to psychology, that idea of compartmentalization sometimes gets in the way. And so many times in my own career, when I faced significant business disruptions or significant business challenges, I just stop and think to myself, I had a career as a professional bodyguard for a while too. If I look at the martial arts and the close protection side of my career, I faced so many things that were so much more stressful, so much more
Mm.
consequential. People
Yep.
could die or get badly hurt. Facing a bad month of results and having to turn around a poor performing business division is not that catastrophic compared to
Right.
somebody trying to choke you out.
Right. Right. The implications are different. Yeah.
You got it. So it's really interesting. In fact, one of the pieces I find missing in a lot of modern day crisis response and crisis management work, and we do a lot of that, is that people are not taught how to manage their adrenal response.
Mm.
And if I can't manage my adrenal response, I can't cope with stress. So part of the journey is actually, and that's a good linkage back to the physiology component, which
Yeah.
we speak about as an enabler. If I can't manage the way my body naturally responds to stress, the way my body performs when I need it to, how am I going to guarantee sustained high performance? So you actually
Mm-hmm.
can't separate the physical from the mental, and we actually then can't separate the way the brain and the nervous system connects the two.
Yeah, this is so interesting. So part of this then is, are you like you're purposely exposing yourself to a certain amount of stress that might mimic something else? So let's say you've got an upcoming board meeting, or I don't know, an all hands presentation. You've got a high stakes meeting of some sort. You're sort of simulating that in advance. What's the practical sort of application here?
Interesting. So in the book we talk, and my previous book I explored this a lot more, but that had to do a lot more with personal safety. From a business perspective, if we look at the way we manage adrenal response, which is how the uh, stress inoculation process
Yes.
goes, there's really not much substitute for experience.
Mm,
But some experiences, to your point, you might have this consequential board meeting that you have to get right. If you mess this one up, right, your job could be at stake, the business could be at stake. So that's where realistic repetitive training comes into play. So if you
mm,
can, as you discussed, rehearse, practice, get coached, etc., there's a part of the brain that actually doesn't differentiate between what we visualize and what we experience. And there's been a lot of experiments run on this piece. So
Yes.
just learning the mental game of how to visualize effectively sometimes can make you 30 to 60% more prepared than if you didn't do it at all. So the stress inoculation process is literally anything that would cause you an adrenal response. Let's first try and get experience. If we can't get experience, let's use realistic repetitive training. If we can't do that, let's use visualization, mental role play,
I
or
love that.
desktop exercise.
Yes.
And the last two components of that are physical health maintenance and mental health maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm not physically healthy, my body's constantly in a state of stress, which means I have less
Yes.
energy to actually apply to my decision making or performance. If I'm mentally taxed, already I'm running at an energy deficit. And in fact, there's two variables I often talk about, and I mentioned in the book too: time and energy, right? Time you never get back, and energy has to be replenished.
Yeah.
So if we don't align the way our body performs, the way our mind performs, and the way the brain connects these two pieces, our performance is always going to be a little lackluster or not as good as it could be. So any executive wanting high performance actually needs to look at this whole process and go,
Yeah.
if I was physically healthy, mentally strong, and emotionally stable, if I understand how how my brain works and how I make decisions, if I understand the audience I'm presenting to and what they want to receive and how they want to receive it, we will get a far better output.
Yes.
So, so many times, and I've seen this with experienced executives particularly, there's this idea of I've done this all before, I don't need to do the homework, I don't need to prepare. In some cases, that may be true when somebody's got 20 or 30 years experience because their homework has been building themselves to that point. But you will always perform better if at the very least you just stop and visualize and make sure your breathing is okay and your body is feeling good.
Yes. Well, it's a really nice layered system. Like experience comes with time. So the only way to build it is to do it. But then, too, the rehearsal or the practice layered on top of the visualization. Like what's coming up for me is like, how do we actually layer doing all of these things so that we can perform at our best? And I think if you're a professional athlete, you're going to do that. You're going to visualize before a game. You're going to make sure you're physically healthy before that game. You're going to practice ahead of time. Why wouldn't we apply all of those same principles for these high stakes events that we have at the work in the workplace?
I agreed 100%. And it goes even further than that, right? If we look at the two aspects I discussed around Presilience, that's the proactive prevention piece, right? I'm inoculating myself before the event. But if I've done that right and I've built what we refer to as risk intelligence, okay, the ability to make great decisions, to seize an opportunity and manage a downside outcome, then even when things change, which inevitably they do, you're positioned to capitalize on the change.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the pieces that really drove me with this Presilience concept was missed opportunity that I kept seeing over and over with my clients and even in my own business career. There's few things worse than seeing an opportunity that could be great, but you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time or not resourced enough,
Mm.
or even worse, you only see it in hindsight and go, oh man, if I'd have seen that earlier, I could have done something really awesome. So the idea with getting Presilience right is this combination of managing the potential negative downside, but positioning yourself to be able to grab upside when it comes, because it doesn't often knock twice. And if you miss the opportunity, sometimes it's gone.
Right. Right. Okay. Awesome. So we've talked in depth about the psychology of presilience or leveraging the mind. Talk a bit about, again, we could probably talk for 5 hours in this one alone, the neuroscience. So leveraging the brain. How is that an enabler? What are some things we should be thinking about to optimize our performance at work?
Again, so many pieces there, but I'll just pick one. And a lot of this stuff is contained in the book. But what I ended up doing when I was teaching the psychology of risk was referencing, people like Dr. John Medina, who wrote the book Brain Rules. And I had
Mm.
numerous detailed chats with him in writing Presilience. And then looking at, for example, other research out of neuroscience, Dr. Matthew Lieberman's neural seesaw, which actually showed that we use the same neural architecture for emotive and factual decision making and
Oh,
communication.
interesting.
which is fascinating because if you as an executive have ever tried to have both a factual conversation and an empathetic conversation simultaneously, what actually happens with our neural architecture is a seesaw. We're using the same mechanisms, so we actually go back and forward. I've extended that a little bit further to actually go, if you want to think strategically, you can't really think tactically at the same time. And if I want to be tactical, I also need to understand the strategic intent. So one of the terms we've come up with that we leverage quite a lot is a concept we call stactical, strategic and tactical alignment. But it does come back to this neural seesaw. And if once you understand how your brain works, you can actually capitalize on it. And you can go, okay, if I've got to have an emotive conversation and a factual conversation, how do I sequence them so that my brain is not hyper stressed and can perform effectively? Equally, understanding neuroscience and stress, knowing which parts of your brain shut down when you become triggered is really important, because I'm sure if all your listeners at some point have had a debate or an argument with somebody on politics or religion, and usually those two topics never go well.
Right.
Because as soon as people get adrenalized or triggered by facing something that is oppositional to their belief, their rational thinking brain actually switches off and our survival brain switches on.
Interesting.
Which is why people often get very aggressive and heated when they're faced with facts that are oppositional to the belief they hold. So once we start to understand this, we can actually take conflict resolution to another level, because we stop being ruled by intuitive, instinctive responses and actually learn to control our own neural architecture. Which again, we're all human. None of us does this perfectly, even experts at this. But understanding a little bit about how the brain works can help us capitalize on these things and manage the downside, which is literally good risk intelligence, which leads to presilience.
Well, there's so many applications to this, like even the way you structure your meetings. Very simple example, maybe tell me if I've got this right or wrong, but not integrating strategy in maybe a kind of a weekly operational meeting, like trying to separate those so that you're not seesawing as much. Is that an accurate statement?
Possibly, and this is the exciting part about this idea. And I actually look at Presilience more as a mindset and a toolbox. Is the applications are actually endless, because you've got to pick the right tool for the right outcome. So our job, I see with Presilience, is giving people a toolbox. Now, depending on your experience, some very experienced executives have a well-built, well-stocked, ready-to-go toolbox. What they don't often have is a toolbox that enables them to perform both in business as usual and in disruption. Or, for example, people with a highly analytical leaning often struggle with the empathetic human side, or vice versa. People who are empaths struggle with the factual side. So it does go back, and this is a really nice part to insert here, that the crossover between neuroscience and psychology is immense, as is the physiology. And we should be very careful not to fall into exactly where most corporations are struggling today, which is hyper-siloing. No, this division does this, or this division does that.
Right.
Because to be agile now, we actually have to understand how to use network architecture as opposed to linear architecture.
Yes.
So this linear architecture works really well when we have two variables, a high degree of control and a high degree of certainty. I'd ask your listeners to honestly think about how much of their business falls into the category of high control, high certainty.
Right.
And how much falls outside of that scope, and accept the reality that we need different skills to manage both. So if you've done an MBA, for example, and you've been a very accomplished senior executive in a large corporation that's older than 30 years, and I can quantify that for you a bit later, but it's basically pre-internet age. We were really in an era there where control and certainty was based on hierarchy. In the world we live in now, where people are hyper-connected, the access to the world's knowledge is in your pocket, and we are overwhelmed with misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, our ability to make decisions is different and needs to be different. So thus the Presilience piece is really important when we start thinking of not just the academic theory of, how does the brain work or how does the mind work, but to your point, how does somebody use this to get better outcomes in a world that is changing faster than humans can keep up?
Right. Yeah. Maybe one last segment here before we wrap up, Gav. We've touched on this, the physiological or the, leveraging the body aspect. How do you think about performance when it comes to the physical side?
Great. So the short answer to that is you are you, right? You are the sum total of your body, your mind, your spirit, your being. We've created these fictional separation areas where we've gone,
Right.
okay, this is my work life, this is my personal life, this is my mental health, this is my physical health. Where in reality, your physical health affects your mental health affects your physical health. And if we don't align these pieces, we get a far degraded level of performance. And what's been fascinating is when, for example, you look at John Medina's work in his book Brain Rules, one of the ways to get the best performance out of your brain is to be physically fit and healthy and
Mm,
exercise. So much of the challenge we have to overcome today is based on these ideas we've built over the last few thousand years by chunking knowledge into categories and then believing that those categories don't intersect. Whereas in reality, they all do. And the last point with that is we almost started this conversation with this idea, but what is the point of achieving incredible business success and wealth if you're not healthy enough to enjoy it?
right.
What is the point of making sure you are financially stable if you're not healthy? So practically, these things are actually the same. You can't achieve those two outcomes, sustained high performance during business as usual or thriving through disruption, unless you are the best version of you. And that's a continuous journey to create the best version of you. Equally, and this is probably the last important segue for your listeners on the physiology piece, we are constantly facing stress. Stress is not necessarily negative, right? Positive stress enables us to perform well. The challenge is if we don't exercise and we don't eat properly and we don't actually use our bodies, a lot of those negative chemicals that are released when we are hyperstressed, which would have been burnt up if we were fighting or flighting, don't get burnt up because most of the time we're talking to someone on the computer or on the phone. We're not physically fighting or running. So if you're not physically using your body, but you're getting adrenalized due to the stress you're facing, your performance will degrade.
Hmm.
So if you want to manage depression, if you want to manage anxiety, if you want to manage stress, regardless of your physical shape. So even if you're in a wheelchair or you're not physically able, you do what you can. And it's interesting, about 3 or 4 years ago, I had lower back spinal fusion and I was in
Wow.
bed for a couple of months and I had to kind of teach myself to walk again post that. But one of the things I kept in my head was I trained for that surgery like I was training for a fight. I went in as fit and as
Oh,
healthy as
love
I
that.
could, which sped my
Right.
recovery up to the point that a year and a half after the surgery, I did my 8th degree black belt grading.
Wow.
Um,
That's amazing.
but other little things, for example, I kept saying to myself, move what you can. So even when I was lying in bed in hospital, all I could do was wiggle
Mm.
my toes and my fingers. I created movement wherever I could, and it sped up the recovery process tremendously. So you do what you can from where you are
Yes.
based on the outcome you want to achieve. And I think it's very easy in the modern world to fall into almost a victim mindset of going, oh, this hasn't gone the way I wanted. But that doesn't achieve sustainable high performance. In fact, it achieves the opposite.
Thanks for sharing that story. I mean, that's super inspiring. I think we can apply that to, any event, any high stakes event that we have going on at work. And you're right. Like I noticed that when I noticed the connection between all three, the physical, the neuroscience, the brain, and the psychology. When I'm really fit, I'm more confident, I'm better able to perform with my clients, in front of my clients. I'm a better writer. Like these things are all connected. So it's nice to be able to break them up in terms of planning and what my week might look like, but they're all linked.
And to your point, often when I'm speaking to athletes or physical high performers, I'm actually running the opposite. I'm telling them, hold on, you need to have a bit of business savvy. You need to understand,
Yeah,
how other parts of your life might work post your physical career.
right.
So, part of the challenge with this is not rocket science, honestly. The idea of presilience and resilience have been around as long as humans have had to make decisions. The challenge we've got is never before have humans been in the position we're in, where technology is changing so fast we can't keep up. We are so hyper-connected, and the challenges we're facing in the business world are directly resultant to that. So if we're not bringing the best of ourselves, guaranteed you will get left behind. And the AI and Gen AI bubble is a great example of that. I don't think AI will take anyone's job, but people who understand how to leverage AI will take your job.
Right.
So
That's
the
well
ability to link
said.
these things is important.
Yes. Uh, Incredible conversation. Thank you so much. Dr. Gav, how can people get in touch with you?
Easiest is my personal website, drgavschneider.com. Equally, my business website, risktosolution.com with the letter 2. Either of that, and LinkedIn is where I do most of my social networking. So feel free to reach out and connect. And thank you for listening. And Sal, thanks for the opportunity to talk about things that I really am passionate about.
Thank you. I know this episode is going to be immensely helpful for people, and I think it'll expand our thinking to go beyond just our traditional approach to work, to think more holistically about how we can perform. Thanks, Dr. Gav.
Thanks, Sal.